Hi there, I'm Victoria Peat, and in this video tutorial I'm going to show you how to make an 18-degree Dresden plate, both a full circle, a half and a quarter. I'm going to show you how to cut out and prepare your fabrics, how to sew your blades, and how to add your central sections. Dresden plate is a circular quilt block that is created by making a number of blades that radiate from a central point. Each of the blades are sewn together to form a full circle, and that circle is then appliqued onto a background fabric. The center of the design then has a circle appliqued over the top. You can have a full Dresden plate, or you can have portions of that circle making a half or a quarter. So these you might hear called a Dresden fan. This particular design is an 18-degree Dresden. And what that means is that you take a circle that has 360 degrees in it, and each of these blades radiate out at an angle of 18 degrees. This means that a full circle will have 20 blades in total. The half will have 10, and the quarter will have 5. In this particular design that I have for you in this video, it features a large central circle. So the blades are shorter in length and their ends are covered by either the large circle, half or quarter. I have a PDF available with 4 different sizes of templates to make the 18-degree Dresden fan or Dresden plate design. We've got blades that come in a small, medium, large and extra large, and here they all are shown as the quarter fan. The small blades will create a 6-inch block. The medium will make a 8-inch block. The large will make a 10-inch block, and the extra large will make a 12-inch block. And those are all the finished sizes. You can, of course, use these to create a rectangular, so a half size, like I showed you earlier. So the half fan, you can use each of these sizes. So this will create a 12 by 6 block, a 16 by 8, 20 by 10, and a 24 by 12 if doing the half plate or the fan. And if you're looking to do the full Dresden plate or the full circle, using the small, you'll be able to create a 12-inch square block, a 16-inch square block with the medium, moving up to a 20-inch finished, and then finally the largest size, you'll be able to create a 24-inch by 24-inch Dresden plate with these extra large blades. When it comes to cutting out the fabric for the blades, you need to get your template from your pattern, and the pattern that I have available has the pattern for cutting out the blade templates. But what you need to do first is just double check the 1-inch test square to make sure that this measures correctly. And once you're satisfied that your printing is correct, then you can go ahead and cut out your template. So the template that I have here is where I'm making an extra large. So I have the extra large template, and I have measured the size of the template from one edge to the other, and I'm going to cut out a strip of fabric that measures the same as this trapezium shape, just to make life as easy as possible. So then all I need to do is to take this to one edge of the strip of fabric, line up the top and bottom edges, and then cut along this first edge. Now from here, I can then take my strip the other way round, just because I'm right-handed, and then I can place the edge of the template up against this first line that I've first line that I've cut, and then I can trim along using each of my shapes out as I go. Now, if you are cutting a lot, you're doing more than one block, then you might like to transfer this shape onto a piece of card, just to give it a little bit more durability. And for this, I'm cutting out, I just need to cut out 5. So that's 3. Oh, look, see, I've just cut out some of my fabric, some of the paper there. So that's an excellent advertisement for why you should consider transferring this shape onto a piece of card. Otherwise, if you are cutting out lots, by the time you get to the other end, your bits of fabric are smaller and smaller. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, and then just one more to cut 5. So that's a nice and simple way of cutting out the blades or the fabric to make the blades. If you are making a design with lots of different fabrics, then you can just cut each of them out individually. Or as you can see on these particular templates that I have here, I've got a shaded area in the middle, which is the shape of the finished blade. So if you like, you can cut out this section here to create yourself a fussy cutting template. And with that, you can then take your fabric and select the parts of the fabric that you might like to feature in your finished blades. Now, what I would say is that the only thing with fussy cutting is that you're going off grain. You can see here on the template, I have a grain line, and we're looking to keep that working with the grain or across the grain, but either way, keeping it nice and straight, because when you come to make your blades and press your blades, it just keeps it a little bit more in line and in shape, and it can stretch out of place. However, if you're more confident with your sewing skills and you are very careful with what you're doing, you can choose to fussy cut. You just need to remember to be extra careful. But it does mean that you can do things like place it on your design to pick out a different area so that when your blade is finished, you've got a particular shape in your blade. So you might have one in particular, or you might be doing a series of blades that you all want them all to look the same. Fussy cutting, as ever, does take up more fabric because you need to find the repeats within your fabric. But you might just be looking to get a motif. You might have a really cute print with a woodland animal or a particular stripe that you want to make the most of. So that's there as an option. But like I say, just do bear in mind that you'll be cutting, or likely to be cutting, off the grain of the fabric. So you just have to be careful with your pressing. So now that we have our blades cut out, we need to sew them. And first of all, we're going to create the points on each of the blades. So to do that, we're going to take each blade individually and fold them right sides together. And we're going to sew along this. Let me show you one here. We're going to be sewing along this longer edge here, not the shorter edge. So when you fold them in half, we're going to be sewing along this edge here. And I'm going to start at the edge that's got the 2 raw edges rather than the fold. And I'm going to do a little back stitch. I'm going to sew along, and I'm going to do a little back stitch here. And then I'm going to chain piece the rest of these 4. So I'm going to start with my needle in the down position. And I have a 1/4 inch foot on my machine and a fresh needle. And I'm placing the raw edges of the blade up against the side of my 1/4 inch foot. The stitch length I have is slightly shorter. I'm going to do a couple of stitches, back stitch, and then I'm going to go all the way to the folded edge. A couple of stitches here. And that's sewn. So you've got your back stitch at either end, and we've gone along this longer edge. So that's one done. I'm going to then chain piece the rest of these. So I'm folding in half. I'm not pressing along this folded edge. I'm just folding just to make sure that this raw edge is nice and even with the piece behind, and that this is all matching up nicely. Stop with the needle down and then bring in the next one. So there I have all 4 blades, 5 blades even, sewn along these longer edges. Now I'm going to just snip off the excess threads. Now I've left the tails on the folded edge slightly longer. just to give me that little bit of extra security that the threads won't come undone, because you really want these points to stay nice and secure. Now, what we're going to do next is we're going to fold these through to the right side. But what we want to do is remove some of the bulk of this seam allowance here, because if you turn that through, because this point is quite sharp, all of this extra fabric will make your points quite bulky and chunky. So we want to take off some of this excess. Now you can do this with if you're confident, you can do this with a rotary blade, but if you're not quite so confident, you can just use a pair of scissors, starting at this folded edge, a little way up from that pointed section, and cut a diagonal piece off. So I've just cut, if I lay it out here, you can't quite see, but you can see I've cut off a little bit more at this end than I have here. I've graded it out towards this edge here. So I'm going to do that with all of them. Okay, so that's just got rid of some of that bulk. So now we need to turn these through to the other side. But what I'd like to do first is I'd just like to open out this seam allowance here, just to press that nice and flat. So I'm going to take my pressing surface, just bring that across slightly. And I'm going to just place my iron on the wrong side of the fabric here, just so that I can more easily open up this little seam allowance. And I'm going to take the tip of my iron and just run as far along on that seam allowance as I can. I'm trying not to press these folded edges on the outsides. So I've pressed that nice and flat. I can then put my thumb on the inside here at the point and my index finger at the point of the blade and pop that through. And then I'm going to take my point turner just to encourage that last little bit out. Okay, so I'm going to repeat that process with all of them. Okay, so now that we've got the seam allowances pressed and we turn through to the right side, we need to press these absolutely flat so that we can then join them together to create either our quarter, half or full circle of the Dresden design. Now you can do this one of two ways. If you take your blade wrong sides together and you're looking to just press a center line, finger press a center line, so that we can match this sewn line up with the center of the blade. So I'll place that right sides together and I'll just finger press in the middle, and that will give me a little crease so that I can line up my blade, the center here where I've stitched, where I have finger pressed, and now I can press that flat, because what you don't want is to create blades that are uneven. Just place that under my clapper. So what you don't want is for this seam line here, and I'm exaggerating, what you don't want is for this seam to be going here, because then you're going to end up with a point that isn't even on both sides. The other option you have is, if you have my my pattern for these Dresden blades, I also include a I can't get my words out, a blade pressing template for each of the different sizes. And that you can slide into your blade, put the point, and I've put this on card to make it a bit more durable and easier to press against. I'll place that into the blade. The point will sit up in the point of your blade, and at the bottom you can line up your edges, your sides and your bottom to line up with the template, and that just gives you something to press against. So it's really up to you how you prefer to work, but that's there as an option for you, because that just allows you to line up the sides, and your stitched line seam that you've created will line up with the line on the template. I like to just place my blades underneath a wooden clapper whilst they're cooling down to allow the pressed edges to set nice and firm. And I'll do one more with the first technique I showed you, where you finger press. So I'm just eyeballing approximately where on the fabric it's going to, the bottom of this seam is going to sit. Place that right sides together and just a little finger press. You don't want to do it with your iron, because what you don't want is for each of your blades to have a pressed line down the middle. So a finger press will suffice. So allow those to cool before you come to sew them all together. Right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew these together. Because we are working with an 18 degree Dresden, which are again 5 per quarter, 10 per half, and 20 per hole. What I'm going to do is I'm going to sew them into pairs. So I'm going to sew 2 pairs, and then I'm going to sew a 5th one to create that 5. And then if I'm doing a half, I'm doing 2 halves and joining them together. And if I'm doing a whole, I'm going to do the 4 quarters, join 2 to make a half, and then repeat the same thing and join the 2 halves together. It just helps with squaring things up and making sure that it creates a nice flat Dresden. Now, what I've done is I've just had a bit of a play whilst this is a pattern fabric. What I wanted to do is just make sure that the pattern was nice and it flowed in a way that I was happy with. So I have played around and I've done that. I'm now going to sew these 2 together, then these 2. I'm going to place those right sides together, and I'm going to sew along this edge because we're going to be sewing them along here. Now, these ones aren't too bad, but sometimes what you'll find is that these aren't always exactly the same length. You may have had an issue with your cutting, you may have been fussy cutting, whatever the case is, that these may not always measure exactly the same length. What is important is that you start sewing from these folded edges that you've just pressed, and you're sewing towards this short raw edge. But you're always making sure that this edge matches up. If these edges here don't match up, it doesn't matter, because you're going to be covering it with a center circle or portion of a circle. So you always want to make sure that this edge is matching. Don't worry so much about this edge. So we're placing those right sides together, and then across at the sewing machine, again, I've got my machine set up with my 1/4 inch foot, and I'm starting with the needle in the down position. Making sure that these raw edges match, and I'm going to slide this underneath my 1/4 inch foot, and my guide here is up against this raw edge. I'm going to do a couple of stitches, and then I'm going to back stitch, and then I'm going to sew all the way to the other end. You don't need to backstitch at this end, but you can do if you would like to. Again, because they're going to be covered with the center circle or part of the circle, it doesn't really matter. This part here will remain secure. You don't have to press this seam open. Now, do bear in mind that this should be the grain, unless you fussy cut, but the grain of the fabric should be running directly through the center of your blade. So here you're working on a slight bias. So bear that in mind when you're pressing, and be ever so careful. I'm going to press that flat just to warm up the fibers. Bring them out so the wrong side is facing uppermost. And then the iron in and press along that seam allowance to press that open. So just be very careful that you're not stretching the fabrics, you're not ironing all the way across and stretching everything out of place. So you can see here, it's nice and matching here. There's a lovely valley, but at this end, it's not level, but that doesn't matter. So I'm going to leave that to cool whilst I sew these pairs. And again, I'm going to make sure that this edge is even. Now, if you're being particular like I am with regards to the placement of the blades, just work in a methodical way. But if you're not too worried, or you can keep track more easily than I can, then you can chain piece these or do multiple at once. And allow that to cool a moment. It just allows the fibers to reset in their place. So now it's up to you. You can either join these two pairs together and then come and join the third one, or you can join the third one to this pair and then come and join the final pair to those three. It's up to you, whichever order you'd like to do it in. I'm going to carry on and join the two pairs together. And again, just very carefully press these. And I'll join this final one. So just to be neat and tidy, I'm just going to take off these excess threads. Careful not to cut into your blades. Right, so the reason that I've sewn these together in groups of 5 rather than in lots of pairs, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this into a half circle of the Dresden design. So because there are 10 of those, I could have just done lots of pairs or 5 pairs and joined those pairs together. But I like to do mine in quadrants because that means that I'm then given the opportunity just to make sure that the quadrants are pretty much at a right angle. So I want this seam allowance or this raw edge here and this raw edge here pretty much to be at a right angle to each other. And then the same thing with this new set that I've done is I'm just using a line on my cutting mat that this comes down at a right angle, because what I want is for these to sit flat. Now, if these were wildly too small and I couldn't get these two on a right angle and it was too tight, or if it was too far this way, I'd need to go back and look at my seam allowance just to make sure that it was an accurate seam allowance that I'm sewing with, because you want this to lie nice and flat. Now, if you're just making the one quadrant, you can fudge things a little bit and iron things into place, and you can remove as some of the error within the seam allowance of the background block. But if you're sewing a half or indeed a full circle, you can't have too much room for error because it just will not lie flat no matter what you do. So it is good practice to try and do these in quadrants, make sure that they're square if you like, and then you can join them together. So that's what I've done, is I've made sure that this first 5 are nice and square, and this second set of 5 are nice and square, and then I'm going to join them together to create that half circle arc. So there we have the completed half circle. What I might do is just move my sewing machine out of the way so I can lay this out for you to see a little bit better. So once you've finished your piecing, you are then ready to applique or prep it and then applique it to your background fabric. You can see here, here's a full Dresden that I've done in the extra small size that I have in my templates, and I've created a full round of a variety of different fabrics, and I've even fussy cut a couple, but I've laid that on this one here works on a 12-inch square finished, so it's a 12.5-inch piece. And what I've done is I've placed that centrally on that square. So I have used a hero marker just to mark across the block, straight up and straight across, and then I've marked diagonally. And what that's allowed me to do is to work quadrant by quadrant to make sure that the seam line between, let's call this quadrant 1 and quadrant 2, this seam line is on the vertical seam line, and then the seam line between this quadrant and this one runs on this horizontal one, and then this third one in the quadrant here runs on this diagonal line. And that just means that I've placed that nice and straight, and I've not gone on the wonk, and I've got it placed exactly how I want. When I'm doing the single a single block with a quarter quadrant, I've placed those raw edges of the outer blades on the raw edges of the square. So I've got lining up here and here. And as I was saying to you before, if your seam allowances are out a little bit or you've not pressed properly, you'll find that this doesn't line up exactly straight. But because I was using this one just for a quarter rather than a half or a whole, it doesn't matter that I'm out a little bit, because this amount that I'm out by is within my 1/4 seam allowance. So that will get trapped both by the circle that will, or quarter circle that will go on top of this, but also when I attach it to another block, because that difference isn't too much. But if you've got that with all 4 quadrants, by the time you come to join them together, you're not going to get this lying flat. So that's why that's important. Before you start to applique, you can place this your Dresden blades in place, and you can see here I've tacked these down. I've just got a long 4.5 setting on my straight stitch, and I have tacked those onto my background fabric before I've gone on and done my applique. And I've done the same thing here with my full circle. I've got a line of basting stitches on the inner edges just to keep those in place before I've gone and done my applique. So I'm going to take you through now how I attach my half Dresden onto a rectangular background. So I'm going to prep it first by just marking up my background fabric. So this piece here, because I'm using the extra large blades, I know that I'm going to be attaching those to a piece of fabric here that's 12.5 inches high by 24.5 inches wide to give a 12 by 24 inch finished piece. So I want to mark the center line. So the center line is going to be 12.25 inches. And I'm just going to use a friction pen to mark that center point so that you can see it. I would if the pen was working. I'm going to use my chalk pen instead. So I'm going to mark a little line here and a little one here, just so that I know where my center line is. I'm then going to kind of place my arc on top vaguely, because what I want to do is I want to mark a diagonal line so that I can line up this third. So if you look at this in a quadrant, I want to line up the 1, 2, third one, the point of that I want to mark with the diagonal line coming out from the corner here, just to try and make sure that it's all placed nicely. So I'm just kind of going where I need to go. I'm not going to use this because I'm not sure that will necessarily come out of this white. So I'm going to use my hero marker. I'll work on this side first. I'm going to take my ruler and place my 45-degree line of my ruler along the shorter edge of my block. You can do the same thing when you're working with a square. Place the point against the corner, line up that line, remove that out the way. So I'm at about 6.5-ish inches. coming out on my ruler, so I'm just going to run a hero marker along there to create an indentation in my fabric, so I've got something to line up against. So I want to do the same on this corner. Just going to flip this around so it's not quite so awkward. So again, I've got my point lined up with the corner of the piece of fabric. I've got my 45-degree line running along this short edge, and then I'm going out to somewhere around 6.5 to use my hero marker to make that indentation. So I've now got those little guides to help me with placing my arc. I'm then going to start off with this center between the two quadrants and just trying to make sure that that lines up nice and straight. And I'm going to work towards the outer edges. I just need to bring that down a little bit. So I'm trying to get these raw edges lining up with the raw edges on the outer edges of the background fabric. I'm lining up this center seam here with my center line that I've marked, and I'm trying to get these points to go through this diagonal line. And then what I want to do is just make sure that these raw edges here are kind of a similar distance from here. You don't have to be too exact, because what you've got to remember is that these raw edges aren't all exactly 100% perfect, but we want to get it as close as we can do. I'm going to take my ruler, and that raw edge is about 6.25 inches. So I'll take that from my center line and just make sure that that kind of works on the other side. And when I'm happy with how all of that is placed, I can then take some pins, and I'm going to go just through the middle of each of the blades. Okay, so I'm happy with how that is now. So next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run my basting stitch or tacking stitch along the seam allowance on the lower edges against the raw edges of the background fabric. And I'm going to run one along this curved edge here just to hold all of those in place. I can then go ahead and applique each of these pressed edges of all of the blades, and you can do that either by hand to create a really soft, gentle look and nice and neat and tidy, or you can go ahead and do a machine stitch. For the purpose of quickness, I will be doing a machine stitch to attach all of these in place. I have a standard presser foot on my machine. I've swung my needle all the way across to the right hand side, and I've increased my length to 4.5, just so that I can do this basting stitch just to attach the side of this blade to my background fabric. So now what I'm going to do is, without shaking the camera, I'm going to run a basting stitch around the inner edge of this half circle of blades. And I'm going to do that within the seam allowance. Now, if you're working with my pattern, I've allowed about a 3/8 of an inch under here, under where the central circle is going to sit. So you've got a little bit of room to play with, but just check the pattern that you're working with. It may only have 1/4 of an inch. I'm carefully going to go around, not sewing over any pins, but just making sure that the blades stay in place. Now, if things start to ruck up, you can always stop with the needle in the down position, lift the presser foot, and then place it back down, because you don't want to warp the position of these blades. And now I'm just sewing up this final edge to keep that blade in place. Okay, so now you can go around, now that that's secured in place, you can either go around by hand. I would do a lovely little invisible stitch just to catch the very edges. If you're doing this by hand, do make sure that you just catch the very point and keep that secure to the background, because that will just make a really lovely finish. I'm going to go and attach mine by machine. So I'm just going to change the foot on my machine. And I'm changing mine for an edge stitch foot. I'm making sure I'm resetting my machine back to standard. And then from here, I'm just going to change my needle across a little bit to position number 3, so that when my needle drops, I'll check that against the blades in a moment, and I'm just going to reduce my stitch length a little bit. So I'm going to place the guide against the pressed edge of my blades. Just going to lower my presser foot, lower my presser foot, but lower the hand crank just to see where this needle drops versus where my seam guide is, or the edge guide, just to make sure that I'm happy. It's quite close to the edge, so I just might adjust that a little bit, just by a smidge. And I'm going to sew along with this shorter stitch length to attach the blades to the background fabric. If you're working with smaller blades, you may want to just be careful about your pins and just making sure that you're removing those as you go. Come as close up to the point as you can. Stop with the needle in the down position. Just hand crank that. Lift the presser foot and rotate your work. I'm lining the guide up with the second side of the point of the blade. Now, if you're using a foot with a guide like this, just make sure that it doesn't catch on the next blade. If it does, stop with the needle in the down position, lift your presser foot and readjust. And now I'm coming down to where this seam allowance is here, or the seam is here. And then I'll know that's when I need to pivot, lift my presser foot, swivel my work, and then come back up the next blade. And I'm just going to repeat that all the way around my work. So there you have, all stitched in place. Take the pins out. So if you are working on one that's a lot smaller, you may have taken your pins out as you've gone. I'll just take those out. And from here, I'd probably be tempted to give this a bit of a nice press and then place it on one side, ready for when the center is ready to be added on top. So next up comes preparing the center for the design. So depending on which version you're working with, you're either going for a quarter circle, a half circle, or a full circle. If you're working from my templates include a cutting line, so for cutting out your fabrics, and then there's a dashed orange line on that's a little bit smaller, which is for a pressing template. So I've used the outer edges of the templates for cutting the fabrics, and then I've gone in and I've attached the template to a piece of card just to give it a little bit more thickness and durability. and then I've trimmed those down using paper scissors to the orange line to create a pressing template. But before all that's done, do just make sure that that 1-inch test square measures correctly before you go ahead and cut any of your fabrics. When it comes to cutting the fabrics, when you're working with the half circle or the quarter circle, do note that there's a grain line shown on the templates. That's just to make sure that you know what you're working with. And when you're working with a half circle, you know that your grain is running vertically through your block. And again, for your 1/4 inch, you know that your grain line will then be running in line with the edges of your block. It will just give it a little bit more stability and will be less likely to move around, because at the end of the day, you're working with a curved edge and things can go a little bit wobbly. But really, you don't want that wobbliness on the outer edges of your block, because it just makes life a lot easier if it's all stable. And when you're working with the full circle, there's no grain line, because of course the grain, it could be any which way, unless of course you're fussy cutting. Then do bear that in mind before you start out and before you cut. So with these, I'm going to show you a couple of bits and pieces with regards to how you can make these central sections. I'm going to start off with the full circle. I'll just place these on one side. So when you are doing the full Dresden plate, where you have all 4 quadrants and you've created a circular design, you need a full circle to cover the middle. Now, when you come to make this, you can do this in one of 2 ways, really. You can cut out your fabric circle using the cutting line, and then you can place your template in the middle and press over the edges of the template, or you can create a double-sided circle that you then applique on top. 2 different versions. If you decide to do the this method, you cut out 2 circles using your fabric cutting template, and you sew those together using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance all the way around the outside edges. And then you cut those, either trim those down with a pair of scissors or use some pinking shears to reduce that seam allowance and just allow a little bit of flexibility when you come to turn that through. So you've got those 2 pieces of fabric, the right sides together. You then pinch these out just to make sure that the your outer fabric isn't touching your lining fabric. And the lining fabric can be any fabric you like. The lighter weight, the better. You could also use a non-fusible interfacing as well, because that's nice and lightweight. But you pull those apart and do a little snip, and then turn everything through to the right side. As you turn it through to the right side, you can take a point turner and just run that along the stitched edge to try and smooth out the line of stitching. And when you're happy with that turned through, you can then press that with an iron to create a nice smooth edge. Just make sure that your, we'll call it lining fabric, isn't poking out and it's sitting nicely behind your main fabric. And then when that's ready, you can place that on top of your work, pin it in place, and then applique again, either by hand or by machine. If you don't want to make the double-sided circle to applique, you can take your fabric, let's move this out the way. You can take your plain fabric circle and take your pressing template and place that on top centrally. And because you've put a little bit of card on the underside, you've made that a little bit thicker, a little bit firmer. You can then take your iron and flip up the fabric and press that against the template. To make things even easier, what you can do is you can run a basting stitch, a longer stitch around the outer edges of your circle, so that once you've started pressing that inwards, you can then pull on those longer stitches to gather the fabric in a little bit. And then you can flip it over and press from this side once you've got your nice curved edge. Okay, so for me, It comes down to whether you're more confident with stitching in a circle or whether you're more confident in pressing in a circle. And of course, the double-sided circle creates a little bit more bulk, but it will make it stand a little bit more proud. So it's up to you which version you want to go with. But when you're happy with whichever method you've chosen, try and find the grain and place that on your work, because visually it will look a little bit nicer if you can match the grain up with the grain in the background fabric. It's very, very subtle, but it can sometimes make a difference. So when you're happy with your placement, you can then pin in place and either slip stitch in place, or you can go around and applique that with a machine stitch, whichever way works best for you. So when doing the quarter circle and the half circle, you're using the pressing technique. You could do the double-sided version if you like, but I'm going to be doing both of these with the pressing technique. Again, I've got the templates added to some card, and I've trimmed those down to the pressing edge. And I will just show you on the half circle, but the quarter circle is going to be done in exactly the same way. I'm lifting the fabric with the side of my iron over the template. So you could use paper, but of course it doesn't have such a thick edge, so it makes it a little bit more challenging. And you can pull those gathering stitches a little. I'm just pulling one thread, either the bobbin or the top thread, just to pull in a smidge. Helps bring that seam allowance in, and then you can slide your template back in if you want to. Okay, so once you're happy with your curve, allow that to cool, and then you can remove your basting stitches. Section can then be added to your blades. I'm just going to find the center point at the top and the bottom just to try and make sure that I'm placing that evenly. Oh dear. So that's covering the ends of the short ends of all of these blades. That's lovely. Pin that in place. Just making sure that my raw edges here match up. So that's all positioned and ready to be stitched in place. I would run, as I did with the blades, I would run a basting stitch along this lower edge to keep that in place. And then you can stitch this like we did with the blades, either by hand, which would look really lovely, nice and neat, or you can, if you're confident with your stitching, you can sew in place with a straight stitch around this curved edge, just a few millimeters or like a 1/16 of an inch in from this outside edge, or you could do something like a zigzag stitch over the top or a blanket stitch, anything you like. But that's ready to stitch in place. If you're working with the quarter circle, I haven't pressed this one yet, but once I had done, I'd place that in place. I'd line up the raw edges on the left and the right, sorry, not the left and the right, the vertical and the horizontal, and I would stitch that in place with a basting stitch, and again I would go in and stitch that curve afterwards, just to make sure that as you're stitching that you're not gradually moving the fabric along and it's moving out of place. So I would just baste that in place to begin with. So I'm just going to go ahead and stitch that one by machine now. I have my edge stitch foot on, and I have swung my needle across to the left hand side a little bit, and I've increased my stitch length to about a 4.5, just to run this line of basting stitches to keep my center in place. And the line of stitching I'm doing is within my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now, when it comes to stitching or machine stitching this in place, I've got my guide up against the outer edges of my curve, and I want my needle to swing across a little bit further to the right. I think I'm maybe going for, on my machine, a 3. Drop that, just making sure that I'm close enough to the edge and not too far into the center of the curve, because what you don't want is to have anything here flapping up. Just bringing my stitch length down again. Now, if you have a knee lifter, these come in handy when you're doing something like curves, because you can very easily just lift your presser foot and readjust your work as you go. Always stopping with the needle in the down position when you're pivoting, or stopping to remove a pin. So there you have your half circle attached to your half Dresden design, and you just give that a nice press, and then that is good to go to add into whatever project you might be working on. You might be working on the Make Time Quilt, which is a collaboration I've done with a number of other designers. So if you're interested in that, have a look in the description below, and I'll add a link to that pattern. But you could be using this as a feature on another quilt, or you might be making a glorious cushion or something like that. But there you go. There's your half circle done. 24-inch by 12-inch version of the Dresden Fan that you saw in this demo features in the Make Time Quilt project. It's a collaboration between 4 of us British quilt designers that really focuses on making time to do the things that make you happy. There are quilt blocks themed around spending time in nature, pursuing creative hobbies, spending time with friends and family, and taking time for a little self-care. To accompany the project, there are a whole host of blog posts and tutorials that will help you make this great quilt. You can find out more and buy a copy of the pattern bundle by following the links below. If you would like a set of my 18-degree Dresden Plate templates, you can get a copy from my website or my Etsy store. There are links below to both outlets. Don't forget, you'll get templates for 4 different sizes, each of which can be used to make a full Dresden plate, or the 2 different versions of the Dresden Fan that you saw in this video. There are more patchwork and quilting demos to come, so make sure that you subscribe to my channel to be kept up to date. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time.